So we're talking about Ireland's killer women, basically. They're few and far between compared to the men, but no doubt there's 16 of females in custody in Ireland serving life in prison. And they were just recently joined by Ruth Lawrence, who was found guilty of killing Anthony Keegan and Eoin O'Connor in 2014 in a gangland killing. But we finished off the last episode there with the promise of something particularly grotesque, which is the case of Sabrina Cummins.
Yeah, and I mean, this was Sabrina and her brother, Kenneth. And again, these are people with, I suppose, serious drug issues. And they used to call to this gentleman's house, Thomas Horn, who was 63 at the time. He lived in Ringsend. And they went to rob him, or decided when they were there, they were going to rob him this time. And essentially, the murder then was to cover up that robbery in their kind of twisted logic. But he was essentially tortured, and it was all for €50, and that was it. She did her best to lie her way through it. She was described in court as a hard-nosed and brazen lawyer. She tried to blame her brother for it, but the jury obviously saw through that. Basically, their victim was he was beaten. They strangled him with a leather strap and even tried to poison him with household cleaning fluids. And he died with a plastic bag being held over his head as he desperately fought to save his life. And it was a completely senseless murder that was simply to try and cover up the robbery. And this is a man who had never shown anything but kindness to this troubled brother and sister. And the idea then, that he ran into people who had such a darkness in them, whether it was already there or exacerbated by their own troubles.
And Thomas Horan would have been a pensioner, probably without much money. I mean, this was all over 50 quid.
Yeah, I mean, he certainly wasn't, a wealthy man by any means, no.
Katherine O'Connor, I always recall her because of the facial tattoos. She came across as such a sinister, kind of memorable figure during her trial. Yeah,
I mean, she was. I mean, it's the one I always kind of visualized, that image of her with the swastika kind of tattoo on her face, wasn't it? It was kind of I'm not sure if it was a swastika or whether it was actually a Celtic design, but kind of the first thing that strikes you is unusual just to have even a facial tattoo, and more so for a woman to do so. So she was actually involved in a double murder of Jonathan Duke and John Forrester in Bandon in February 2012. I mean, basically it happened in kind of a 24-hour period, and neighbours in Bandon had spotted a body being dumped into the river from an apartment balcony where they lived.
Just out over the balcony into the river?
Yeah, and I think one of them actually landed on a kind of a walkway, and they had to go down and tip it over to get it into the water. And the Gardaí who were called to the scene, they followed a trail of blood into the flat where they found O'Connor lying on the couch in just her underwear with blood on her hands and feet. Jonathan Duke's body then was found in the river, having been stabbed a dozen times, and a few hours later they found John Forrester, who would have been an ex of Katherine O'Connor, also tied up and dumped in the river.
So what happened in that house? Was it another sort of drinking session, chaotic?
It's exactly what it was, yeah. And there was kind of they mentioned that there was an aspect of jealousy, and then that the other man who turned up afterwards was just simply killed because he now knew too much.
And she was 49.
She's 49 now. So that was 2011 was that murder. So that's 14 years ago. Yeah. So she would have been, in her early 30s at that stage.
Yeah, it's just the ages of them is extraordinary, and I suppose some of them have served some of their sentence, including Dudko.
Yeah,
they're 47, but she's 10 years at least in prison. Now, she killed her mother.
Yeah, again, and this is one that you kind of wonder, in terms of the psychiatric background. Like she attacked her mother. They had a row, with her mother in the house they shared in Clonsilla at the time. It was Christmas Eve in 2010, and she slammed her mother's head against the wall and hit her with a bottle. Now, Dutko was a mother of one and a nurse, and she'd been struggling with alcohol, and weeks earlier had left her own house that she shared with her husband. She claimed he'd been having an affair, and on the night of her mother's death, the husband arrived to find her asleep and drunk, and she agreed then to let him take their child home with him. And then when Greta's mother, she arrived back an hour or so later, a row broke out between the women, and that ended in her death. Although she pleaded guilty to manslaughter, she was actually convicted of murder and lost an appeal. That was upheld on appeal in 2018.
So her mother, Anna, had taken her in basically after the breakup of this relationship with the husband. Yeah. And obviously, clearly, whatever else about the psychiatric, there are a lot of alcohol issues there. Rose Lynch, we have spoken about. Tanya Doyle. Now, I don't remember Tanya Doyle. This was 2009 and she killed her husband, Paul. I mean, you know that word they use, overkill. I think 68 stab wounds is probably that.
Yeah. And I mean, and unfortunately, like, you know, the 999 called to an emergency. They actually kind of heard this going on.
Okay.
It was pretty horrific. And like, it was an unusual case. Like, she had actually been working as a prostitute at this time, and she was separated from her husband, and she wanted him to sign over the house, or, you know, there was some kind of you know, motive in that regard. And his pleas for mercy were heard, and he's called, like, he was actually ringing the emergency services while she was attacking him, and they could hear him, like, you know, begging her to stop. Like, she was 40 at the time it happened. She's 53 now, I think. And it's she was jailed for life in 2013. And it was at the home that they used to share in Tala. And when she asked, the guards actually asked her, like, if she had meant to stab him so many times. She says, I did, yeah, because I wasn't going to be done for attempted murder, because she wanted a fresh start with decent money. And he wouldn't sign the house over. This is what she said. Now, she was diagnosed with a psychiatric condition, but this wasn't deemed to have played a role in the murder, according to medical witnesses. And there was an issue then of the victim's employer potentially having to pay out €1 million from a pension scheme to her. It wouldn't be necessarily in a lump sum, but that would be the value of it. And I think the victim's family would have actually campaigned on this for a little while to try and change the legislation. Now, she wasn't.
So would she have been entitled to it after murdering him?
Well, that's the thing. You shouldn't be able to. I mean, this is an argument they had with Catherine Evan, that you shouldn't be able to benefit from you know, somebody's death. You know, if you caused their death. So if you kill someone, you shouldn't get it. But at the same time, if you're married, you were entitled to this before they died anyway. So, but at the same time, if you caused their death, then therefore you shouldn't be allowed. So if you, say, for instance, own half of a house with your husband and you kill him, the argument then, and certainly it was in Catherine Evans, that she shouldn't get her husband Tom's half. But I think the law allowed her to keep her half of the sale of the assets, which was, I suppose, it's kind of seen as not necessarily, like in her case, if she had received the full amount, that would have been that would be unfair. Like the idea that she was benefiting from killing her husband.
For sure. And I mean, that comes up in many cases along the way. And I suppose even in more complex situations when there's kids involved and, you know, the access to the children then becomes an issue. Yeah,
absolutely. I think you probably, to nail that one down, I think you'd want to get a lawyer who specialises in this area to kind of go through it. It'd be an interesting one to hear.
Yeah, for sure. Now, Charlotte Mulhall is probably the best known of the female killers in Irish jails. Yeah,
and she's rapidly becoming the longest serving prisoner. Like, she's in prison, like female prisoner at this stage. Like, she's in since 2006. She killed Farah Swallow Noor. Her sister Linda was convicted of manslaughter, and of course they were known as the Scissor Sisters. Pretty gruesome in terms of this man was basically, they said they were in fear of him, that, you know, he was a sex pest and probably worse, and they basically dismembered him, and they cut up his body. They left parts of it. Some of it was found in the canal, if you remember. And they did say that they couldn't remember exactly, but they brought a head to a park somewhere, and that was never found. Sitting on the bus. But again, this was like, you know, crazy chaos, like lots of alcohol and drugs
and, you know, a tragic background both of them had.
Very much so,
upbringing. You know, on the day in question, of course, they went in to meet their own mother in town for this street drinking, drug taking kind of soiree, which ended up in murder. But is Charlotte Mulhall, is she due to be released soon?
She's
20 years in.
She's on the way. Yeah, she's on the way out in terms of, I mean, I think even during lockdown, we did a story when she was visiting people in a place in Clondalkin, like she was getting escorted visits, you know, it was 5 years ago. And that she definitely has had more outings since then. You know, I think there is always that kind of element of step down with some prisoners. You know, I think people were wondering why Linda was out so quickly, but she was convicted of manslaughter as opposed to murder. So, you know, she obviously served a much shorter sentence.
She had also essentially gone to the police and told them what had happened. when she'd given a full confession of her own role, certainly in the murder. She had been, I think, tortured really by it, and she told the guards that she just needed to kind of come clean, and she did try and lead them to where the head had been, certainly where she said she'd buried it, but I think it was, never discovered. So 20 years next year, Charlotte will be serving, right? So she was committed in the 27th of the 9th, 2006. So that's a long life sentence, isn't it?
No, it is, yeah. I mean, like on average, I think it's up to 22 years, and that's like including the men.
But from when she went in, it would have been shorter, say from 2006. It's only in more recent years it's been that long, hasn't it?
Yeah, no, it is. It's increasing all the time. Obviously,
yeah.
It's as time goes on, like the stretches are getting longer, and it was a political reaction because there was a lot of kind of upset that even after 7 years, a convicted killer serving time could apply for probation, and even just the act of applying for probation is very upsetting to victims' families. Now, nobody got out after 7 years, or very few did. And then at that stage, like I think this is when Micheál McDowell was Justice Minister, so you're talking quite some time ago. The average was about 12 years, and so it's gone right up to 22.
But she's still a young woman. She's only 42.
Yeah, I mean, she still has look, she does, in fairness, have a chance to get on the straight and narrow, and she won't be the first. I mean, the next person on the list, Deborah Hannon, is unfortunately, she's had her chances and she's back inside. So that's the reason why Charlotte Mulhall isn't the longest serving prisoner. She's now been in prison for 29 years. And
Deborah Hannon.
And
who was she?
She was a teenager when herself and another woman, Suzanne Redden, who was a bit older than her, and they stabbed a 17-year-old girl, Tracy Butler. They stabbed her to death on the Limerick Street in 1993. And it was there was a lot of overkill. Like she had suffered 35 cuts, and Hannon admitted to Gardaí that she used a Stanley blade on her face, and that the revenge was the motive. Redden was 26 at the time, and she admitted to kind of beating up the terrified teenager, Miss Butler, before stabbing her in the chest. And this was in revenge for the death of Hannon's father, William, who Redden had been in a relationship, and he had died 10 days earlier after being beaten up on a Limerick street, and Butler was seen as part of this. Now, they've actually tried to release Deborah Hannon a number of times, and she's even moved to England, and I've got caught up in a brawl over there in the road back here. So she has problems with addiction and alcohol. So I think she's been released 6 times. And she just keeps going. Back in.
Which nicely brings us really to what this is, lifers on licence, because when you get out from a life sentence, you have to remain on licence. You have to remain sort of crime free, or else you're straight back in.
Yeah, and I mean, and sometimes, like depending on the conditions, which I'm sure are kind of to some extent generalized, but there's also specific stuff as well. Like being in a pub even is enough, or and maybe look, if you say, look, I was in a pub because I was at a funeral and I was talking to members of a family, and I didn't drink and I was only 5 minutes in it, you'd probably be fine. But like if you're kind of starting out of the place on 3 or 4 occasions and you're getting picked up by the police, kind of causing a nuisance to traffic, you're going to go back inside.
Now, do they sign on?
In some cases, they do, but it could be every 3 months, or there will be kind of follow-ups with probation, and they will have to attend those meetings or have a very good excuse in advance. I mean, you can miss it temporarily, and if you come up with a good reason, like you're caught in traffic, or and otherwise your record has been good, it's not necessarily an issue. But like if you don't, you will be kind of considered unlawfully at large if you don't turn up for your appointments. And
I suppose the kind of more high-profile people that are out on those licences is Susanna Redden, who was part of the killing along with Deborah Hannon. She's been released on licence. Jackie Noble?
Yeah, I mean, that was another kind of, I suppose, very infamous rather case. Not quite the Catherine Nevin, but like she hired a guy, Paul Hopkins, in February 2004 to kill Derek Benson. Now, this was her abusive partner. He was murdered in May 2000, and she ended up in prison in February 2004. And Hopkins went to town on Derek Benson with a samurai sword. He was totally hacked up. I remember we covered it at the time. I think when I say we, I think it was before I was even working in the Sunday World. That's how long ago it was. And I remember I actually knocked on her door and she didn't want to speak to me, but I left her, I wrote up my name and number on a notebook page and gave it to her. But some of the neighbours said that they were... the blood was actually running down the inside of their walls in the flat below.
Right.
And that he tried to light a fire then to cover up the scene, which of course alerted everybody. So it was kind of the murder was quickly discovered. So
she had hired she had hired Hopkins basically and hadn't actually got a role in the physical.
No, she
murder.
hadn't. And that's, yeah. And believe it or not, she's not the only person to have done this. But if, again, another person who's a lifer on license is Magella Boland. She'd be probably in her 60s now, or just turned 60. And she hired a guy, she paid him £200 at the time. I think it was back in 1989 in Limerick. She was 23 at the time, and she paid Declan Malone, who supposedly is supposed to have links to Irish Republican, the INLA at that time, and she wanted him to have her violent husband, Patrick, scared off, but he ended up shooting him with a shotgun and then clubbing him to death with it. He suffered serious injuries, and and she gave evidence in court. I had a look at some of the cuttings there earlier. And she was beaten during her pregnancies because he wasn't ready. She got married at 17 and immediately was in trouble. She suffered miscarriages as a result of these attacks. And at one point then he dangled a child out of the second story window in their home. And this is what prompted her then to pay this guy to have him killed.
Of course, yeah. There is no defence if it's preempted, of course.
Well, that's it.
Yeah,
it shows intent, premeditation.
If somebody had in a sort of a brawl or in a struggle against some violence, overwhelmed and killed the other person, that can be seen in a different way. Either no crime has been committed, self-defense, or it could be manslaughter.
Yeah, because if you are, there is an argument that if you're trying to defend yourself from an immediate attack, but in this case, if you're able to go and hire someone and give them €200 or promise them €200, you've obviously had time to contact someone else and get someone else to rescue you that doesn't involve killing anyone and to walk away.
You've thought about it long and hard. And finally, Marie Murray, who is 77.
Well, we don't know. If she's still alive, she'd be 77. They went off the radar, herself and her husband Noel. Yeah. They would have been involved in the 1975 murder of Garda Michael Reynolds, and they got the death sentence at the time, which actually caused international headlines. And there was appeals from members of the British Parliament. I think the Pope got involved at the time, and they were actually both retried instead of for capital murder, for common murder, because Michael Reynolds wasn't actually wearing his uniform at the time, and the argument was made therefore that he wasn't identifiable as a guard. So they tried to hold up the Bank of Ireland branch in Killester.
Husband and wife.
Yeah.
And were they involved in republicanism at that stage?
They'd both been, I think, members of official Sinn Féin. And then I think at this point were kind of involved in a more kind of an anarchist group, I think was how it was described in the cuttings I was reading. So that would have kind of coincided with, the likes of the Beta Meinhof gang and all these kind of, extreme left sort of terrorist groups that were kind of appearing at that stage. And a lot of them kind of working, not necessarily in conjunction, but they were kind of trying to overthrow imperialism as they saw it, or the kind of the capitalist system. They weren't hanged, but it would have been, it caused such a furore at the time internationally as well. Yeah. But then on the kind of reconviction, then that was changed to life, and they were released in 1992 and thought to have gone somewhere in the southwest of Ireland to live out the time. So we don't actually really know what happened to them.
If they're still together, if either of them are alive or whatever, but one way or the other, if they are, they're both still on licence and haven't obviously come to the attention of the authorities. Well, we finished there with somebody a murder that occurred in Dublin. I have to say there's a lot of Limerick and Cork going on there, just saying.
Yeah, there is. And I wouldn't like to narrow it down.
No, it's just
that there are some towns that kind of featured more than others. Yeah, okay, maybe the women are slightly more dangerous outside of Dublin than they are inside.
Exactly.
the ladies of the Pale are safer.
I think our short survey has confirmed that. But look, thanks very much, Eamon.
It was a pleasure, Nicola.